The marble halls of the Howard T. Markey Federal Courthouse vibrated with the usual Monday morning bustle. Lawyers clutched coffee cups and briefcases, interns scurried between offices, and the eternal dance of justice ground forward with mechanical precision. But today would be different. Today the machinery would stumble, and the dance would miss a beat. Judge Richard Harrison sat in courtroom 2 billion, his silver hair catching the light that streamed through tall windows. 27 years on the bench had etched permanent lines around his mouth, transforming what was once a natural frown into a carved monument to disapproval. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and studied the docket with practiced indifference. Next case, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority he'd come to view as his birthright. Williams versus Georgetown University, civil rights violation claim. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and Dr. Maya Washington entered. Her charcoal grey suit and pearl earrings spoke of understated elegance, while her bearing carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades proving herself in rooms exactly like this one. As she made her way to the witness stand, several heads turned. It wasn't often that an expert witness commanded such presence. "State your name and credentials for the record," Judge Harrison said, not bothering to look up from his papers. "Dr. Maya Washington, Professor of Constitutional Law at Harvard Law School. I hold a J.D. from Harvard Law, a Ph.D. in Constitutional History from Yale, and I've published extensively on civil rights legislation and its implementation in higher education." Judge Harrison's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And you're here to testify about alleged discrimination at Georgetown University," the word alleged dripped with skepticism. "Yes, Your Honor. I've conducted extensive research on systemic barriers in elite educational institutions, and I've reviewed the specific patterns of—" "Let's be clear," Harrison interrupted, his tone carrying a patronizing edge that caused several attorneys to exchange glances. "This is a prestigious institution with a long history of excellence. We're not here to rewrite their admissions policies based on trendy social theories." The plaintiff's attorney rose quickly. "Your Honor, Dr. Washington hasn't even begun her testimony." "And I'm simply establishing parameters." Counselor Harrison's gaze fixed on Dr. Washington, missing entirely the subtle way she straightened her spine, the slight lift of her chin. "This court deals in facts, not activism masquerading as expertise." A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. In the gallery, a young law student pulled out her phone, fingers flying across the screen as she typed. The machinery of justice hadn't just stumbled, it had begun to crack, revealing the rusted prejudices beneath its polished surface. Dr. Washington's voice, when she spoke, carried the calm of a coming storm. "With respect, Your Honor, perhaps we should let the evidence speak for itself." The war had been declared, though only one combatant knew it, and as the morning light continued to stream through those tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like witnesses to history, the stage was set for a lesson in justice that no one in courtroom 2 billion would ever forget. Dr. Maya Washington's fingers brushed against the smooth leather of her briefcase, a graduation gift from her mother, Sarah, who had spent 30 years cleaning other people's homes in Charleston, South Carolina. Inside that briefcase, beneath the weight of legal documents and research papers, lay a weathered photograph, a small wooden house with peeling paint, a young Maya sitting on the porch steps, surrounded by her mother's prized hydrangea bushes. That house on Mason Street had been both a sanctuary and a launching pad. There, under the glow of a single lamp, Maya had studied late into the night, her mother's words echoing in her ears, "They can take everything from you, baby, but they can't take what's in here." Sarah would tap her daughter's forehead, then her heart. "Fill these up, and nobody can ever make you feel small." Maya had filled them both to overflowing. Valedictorian at her segregated high school, full scholarship to Spelman College, and then the acceptance letter that changed everything, Harvard Law School. She remembered standing in the post office, her hands trembling as she read the words that would lift her from one world into another. Her mother had framed that letter, hanging it right next to the cross in their living room. But Harvard had tested more than just her intellect. In those hallowed halls, Maya learned to navigate the subtle currents of privilege and prejudice. She noticed how professors would check twice when she cited obscure cases from memory, how study groups would mysteriously fill up before she could join. Yet each slight only fueled her determination. She graduated magna cum laude, her mother beaming in the audience, wearing a new dress she'd sewn herself for the occasion. Now, at 52, Dr. Washington carried those experiences like armor. Her recent appointment as Chief Justice, still under wraps for another week, felt like vindication, not just for herself, but for every little girl reading by lamplight, dreaming bigger than her circumstances. The irony of sitting here, being lectured by Judge Harrison about expertise, would have been amusing if it wasn't so emblematic of the very barriers she'd spent her career dismantling. Across the courtroom, Judge Richard Harrison shifted in his chair, the leather creaking beneath his weight. Born into Boston's elite, his path had been paved with inherited expectations. The son of a federal judge, grandson of a state Supreme Court justice, Harrison had grown up in a world where power was passed down like silver cutlery at Sunday dinners. Westfield Academy, Yale undergraduate, Yale Law. Harrison had followed the blueprint laid out for him with dutiful precision. His worldview, like his father's signet ring, was an inheritance he'd never thought to question. Diversity in Harrison's experience meant letting in a few scholarship students from good families who knew how to fit in, how to not rock the boat. His 27 years on the bench had coincided with what he viewed as the deterioration of standards. Affirmative action, gender equality mandates, diversity initiatives each felt like a personal affront to the meritocracy he believed in, conveniently forgetting the phone calls his father had made to secure his first clerkship. Looking down at Dr. Washington from his elevated bench, Harrison saw what he wanted to see: another activist academic trying to impose her agenda on institutions that had worked perfectly well for generations. The fact that she'd attended Harvard only proved to him how far standards had fallen. What he couldn't see was the iron beneath her silk blouse, the steel behind her measured tones. He missed the significance of how the young clerk straightened when she entered, how several senior attorneys nodded in recognition. Harrison's blindness wasn't just racial, it was the deeper myopia of privilege, unable to recognize power that didn't match its preconceptions. The morning light continued to stream through the courthouse windows, painting bars of gold across the floor between them. Two Americas sat in that courtroom, one clinging to its fading authority, the other rising with the quiet inevitability of dawn. And in 1 week, when the press release announced Dr. Maya Washington as the first black female Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, these bars of light would mark the shadow of history passing through courtroom 2 billion. But for now, Dr. Washington simply sat straight-backed in the witness chair, her mother's voice whispering in her memory, "Fill these up, and nobody can ever make you feel small." Her briefcase rested beside her, the old photograph safely tucked away, as she prepared to teach Judge Harrison a lesson that no law school could provide. The plaintiff's attorney, Sarah Chen, rose from her chair with purposeful grace. "Dr. Washington, could you please explain the statistical patterns you've identified in Georgetown's admission practices over the past decade?" Before Dr. Washington could respond, Judge Harrison cleared his throat. "Counsel, I hope we're not about to delve into another one of these fashionable diversity audits." "Your Honor," Chen replied, "Dr. Washington's analysis directly pertains to the plaintiff's claims of systematic discrimination." Dr. Washington began her testimony, her voice steady and clear. "My research team analyzed admission data from 2015 to 2025, focusing on..." And this research, Harrison interrupted, was it peer-reviewed by actual statisticians or just social justice advocates? A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The defense counsel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, recognizing the dangerous territory his advantage was built upon. "Your Honor," Dr. Washington responded, maintaining her composure. "The methodology was vetted by Harvard's Department of Statistics and published in the Yale Law Review. If you'll allow me to continue." Yes, Harrison waved his hand dismissively. "Though I must say, publications aren't what they used to be." "Proceed." Dr. Washington opened her laptop, pulling up a series of graphs. These charts demonstrate a consistent pattern of qualified minority candidates being rejected at 3 times the rate of equally qualified white applicants. When we control for. Dr. Washington, Harrison cut in again, his tone dripping with condescension. "Perhaps in your specialized field, correlation equals causation, but in this courtroom, we require more rigorous standards." The young law student in the gallery was now frantically taking notes, her expression a mixture of disbelief and outrage. Several senior attorneys exchanged knowing glances, while the court reporter's fingers hesitated ever so slightly over her keys. "Your Honor, Doctor," Washington replied, removing her glasses and looking directly at Harrison. I hold a doctorate in statistical analysis from Yale, in addition to my law degree. The methodology here exceeds federal standards for evidence in discrimination cases as established in Anderson v. Liberty Lobby. Harrison's face flushed slightly. Are you presuming to lecture me on legal precedent, Doctor? Not at all, Your Honor. I'm simply establishing the validity of the evidence before the court. The defense attorney, James Morton, stood up, sensing an opportunity in Harrison's obvious bias. Your Honor, perhaps we should question the witness's ability to remain objective, given her personal background. Dr. Washington's assistant, seated in the gallery, quietly opened a notebook and began documenting every word, every inflection, every subtle display of prejudice. The young woman's pen moved with practiced efficiency. She'd been instructed to keep this record, though she didn't yet know why. Indeed, Harrison nodded, warming to Morton's suggestion. Dr. Washington, isn't it true that you've been a vocal advocate for what you call educational equity? I've been an advocate for constitutional compliance, Your Honor. My published work focuses on the legal framework established by Brown v. Board of Education and subsequent. Ah, yes, Brown, Harrison interrupted again, as if discussing a controversial modern theory rather than settled law. But surely you understand that Georgetown's standards of excellence are precisely what's at issue here, Your Honor, Dr. Washington countered, her voice taking on a quiet authority that made several heads turn. When equally qualified candidates receive dramatically different treatment based on race, we must question whether those standards are being applied excellently. Harrison's fingers drummed against his desk. Dr. Washington, in my courtroom we deal with facts, not social theories. Your presence here as an expert witness requires a certain professional detachment that I'm not sure you're capable of maintaining. The defense counsel smiled slightly, but his expression froze as he caught sight of the plaintiff's attorney, Sarah Chen. She was sitting perfectly still, a peculiar glint in her eye, as if watching a trap she'd helped set slowly spring into place. Dr. Washington pulled another document from her briefcase. Let me direct the court's attention to Exhibit C, which details admissions interviews where minority candidates were asked questions that violated Section 1981 of the Civil Rights Act. Dr. Harrison's voice had taken on an edge of irritation. I'm beginning to tire of this agenda-driven presentation. Perhaps in your academic bubble, these theories find a receptive audience, but... Your Honor, Chen interjected, Dr. Washington's testimony is directly relevant to established legal precedent. Mess. Chen Harrison snapped, you'd do well to remember who runs this courtroom. Dr. Washington may be used to holding court in her lecture hall, but here, we require a more traditional standard of expertise. The word traditional hung in the air like smoke, its implications clear to everyone present. Dr. Washington's assistant's pen scratched across paper, recording the moment. In the gallery, the young law student had stopped typing on her phone and was now recording video, her hands trembling slightly with either anger or anticipation. Dr. Washington remained still for a moment, then spoke with measured precision. Your Honor, would you kindly clarify what you mean by traditional standard of expertise? The trap was set. Harrison, too caught up in his own prejudices to see it, plowed forward. I mean expertise based on objective qualifications, not diversity quotas or social justice credentials. This court has a long history of upholding real academic standards, Dr. Washington. Perhaps that's something your perspective hasn't fully grasped. The court reporter's fingers stilled completely. The defense attorney's smile had vanished. Sarah Chen sat back in her chair, a chess player watching the final moves of a long-planned gambit. I see, Dr. Washington said quietly, making a note in her own leather-bound notebook. Shall we proceed with the statistical evidence, Your Honor, or would you prefer to further question my qualifications? The morning sun had climbed higher now, its light no longer falling in bars across the courtroom floor, but instead illuminating the whole space with unforgiving clarity. In that light, every subtle gesture, every biased inflection, every prejudiced assumption stood exposed, documented, and ready to serve a purpose that would soon shake the very foundations of the federal judiciary. The tension in courtroom 2 billion had reached a breaking point. Every interruption from Judge Harrison had built upon the last, creating a powder keg of prejudice that needed only one final spark to explode. Dr. Washington Harrison's voice had taken on the patronizing tone of a teacher correcting a particularly slow student. You keep referring to these statistical models. but surely you understand that constitutional interpretation requires a certain historical perspective. Dr. Washington arched an eyebrow. I assure you, Your Honor, I'm quite familiar with constitutional history. Familiarity isn't expertise. Dr. Harrison leaned forward, his signet ring catching the light as he gestured dismissively. The Founding Fathers established certain principles that, frankly, require a deep understanding of traditional American jurisprudence. This isn't like writing one of your diversity papers. The defense attorney coughed nervously, suddenly aware that something had shifted in the courtroom's atmosphere. Sarah Chen, the plaintiff's attorney, sat perfectly still, her pen poised above her notepad like a conductor's baton before the final movement. Traditional American jurisprudence, Dr. Washington repeated softly. Would you care to elaborate on that, Your Honor? Gladly, Harrison straightened in his chair, missing the warning signs in the dead silence that had fallen over the gallery. This court deals with constitutional law as it was intended, not as certain demographics might wish it to be, while your background might give you insight into specific community issues. Speaking authoritatively on constitutional matters requires a level of expertise that comes from proper judicial lineage and understanding. The court reporter's hands froze over her keyboard. In the gallery, phones had emerged, recording a moment that their owners sensed would soon become historic. Proper judicial lineage, Dr. Washington echoed, her voice carrying a weight that made several attorneys sit up straighter. And in your view, Your Honor, what constitutes proper lineage? Well, it's about tradition. Heritage. Harrison was too caught up in his own prejudices to notice the trap closing around him. It's about understanding the sophisticated legal principles that have guided this nation since its founding. No amount of modern education can replace the kind of innate understanding that comes from being part of that tradition. Dr. Washington slowly closed her laptop. The sound seemed to echo in the silent courtroom like a book closing on an era. Your Honor, she said, rising to her feet with deliberate grace, I feel compelled to address several points you've raised about qualification, tradition, and proper judicial lineage. Dr. Washington, I haven't given you permission to. You've spent this morning, she continued, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the courtroom, questioning my expertise, dismissing my credentials, and implying that my race and gender somehow diminish my understanding of constitutional law. You've suggested that proper judicial perspective belongs to a select demographic, one that, I presume, looks more like yourself than like me. Harrison's face flushed red. I will not be lectured in my own courtroom by the newly appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. The words fell into the courtroom like stones into still water. Ripples of shock spread through the gallery. The defense attorney's mouth opened and closed without sound. The young law student in the back dropped her phone. Harrison's face had gone from red to ash white. What did you say? The announcement was scheduled for next week, Dr. Washington continued. Her voice remained measured, controlled. But given your repeated assertions about proper judicial lineage and traditional expertise, I felt this might be an appropriate teaching moment. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew an official letter bearing the presidential seal. My appointment was confirmed by the Senate on Thursday. I chose to honor my commitment to testify in this case because equal justice under law isn't just a phrase carved on a building, it's a principle that must be defended in every courtroom, at every level, regardless of who sits on either side of the bench. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the usual sounds of the building seemed muted, as if history itself was holding its breath. Your Honor, Doctor. Washington concluded, looking directly at Harrison, whose hands were visibly trembling. You spoke of tradition. Let me remind you of our most important legal tradition. Justice is blind. It doesn't see color, gender, or social status. It doesn't recognize proper lineage, it sees only the facts, the law, and the constitutional principles that protect every American's right to equal treatment under that law. She gathered her materials with careful precision. I believe we should recess for lunch. When we return, I trust we can proceed with a more appropriate level of professional courtesy. As Dr. Washington turned to leave the witness stand, Sarah Chen stood, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. One by one, the attorneys, clerks, and spectators rose as well, paying respect not just to Dr. Washington's new title, but to the dignity with which she had worn it all along. The next 15 minutes in the Howard T. Markey Federal Courthouse unfolded like a slow-motion cascade. Judge Harrison remained frozen in his chair, his hand still gripping the gavel as Dr. Washington's revelation rippled through the building at the speed of whispered words and hastily typed messages. In the gallery, the young law student who had been recording everything finally found her voice. "I got it all," she whispered to her colleague, her hands shaking as she uploaded the video. Every single word. The court reporter, Linda Martinez, who had transcribed proceedings in this courthouse for 23 years, carefully marked the timestamp on her transcript. She knew this document would eventually find its way into law school textbooks. Down the hallway, heads poked out of office doors as the news spread. Harrison didn't know the Chief Justice in his courtroom. The whispers grew into a steady buzz of conversation, punctuated by the soft pings of phones as news alerts began to circulate. Back in courtroom 2 billion, Judge Harrison's clerk, James Wilson, was frantically shuffling through papers, looking anywhere but at his superior. The weight of every dismissive comment, every interruption, every biased ruling he'd witnessed over the years suddenly felt like lead in his stomach. Sarah Chen, the plaintiff's attorney, stood at her table methodically packing her briefcase, allowing herself a small smile. She had known, of course. The timing of Dr. Washington's testimony had been no coincidence. As she closed her briefcase, she caught the eye of Dr. Washington's assistant, who had filled 12 pages with detailed notes of Harrison's behavior. The defense attorney, Morton, had loosened his tie and was dabbing at his forehead with a handkerchief. His entire strategy had hinged on exploiting Harrison's obvious biases, a plan that had just spectacularly backfired. His client, a Georgetown University administrator, was already texting frantically, no doubt seeking to distance himself from the morning's events. Through the courtroom's windows, a crowd could be seen gathering on the courthouse steps. News traveled fast in Washington, D.C., and the sight of reporters beginning to assemble told its own story. Judge Harrison finally moved, his hand releasing the gavel. The sound of it settling against the wood seemed to snap him out of his stupor. His face, still ashen, turned to his clerk. James's voice cracked. "Get me the chief judge on the phone." Sir James replied, his voice steady. "For the first time in their 7-year working relationship, he's already asking to see you," along with the circuit executive. In the back of the courtroom, 2 of Harrison's judicial colleagues had appeared, drawn by the commotion. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to horror as they pieced together what had transpired. Judge Maria Suarez, who had served alongside Harrison for 15 years, closed her eyes briefly, whispering something that looked like Dios mío. The bailiff, who had maintained his professional stance throughout the proceedings, finally allowed himself to exhale. He'd served in this courtroom for 12 years, watching Harrison's subtle discriminations day after day. Now, he straightened his uniform and turned slightly, positioning himself closer to Dr. Washington, a gesture of protection and respect that spoke volumes. Dr. Washington herself stood near the courtroom doors, surrounded by a small group of civil rights attorneys who had materialized from other parts of the building. Their faces shone with a mixture of triumph and vindication. One older attorney, who had argued civil rights cases in this courthouse since the 1960s, wiped tears from his eyes. Dr. Washington Harrison's voice came out barely above a whisper. I request a brief recess too." "Of course, Your Honor," she replied, her voice carrying the same steady authority it had maintained all morning. "I believe we could all use some time to reflect on the importance of impartial justice." As she turned to leave, the entire courtroom, save for Harrison, rose in unison. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor echoed through the room like the closing notes of an era, and the first chapter of a new one beginning. When court reconvened that afternoon, the atmosphere in courtroom 2 billion had transformed. The gallery was packed, with standing room only. Junior clerks pressed against the walls, and several federal judges had quietly taken seats in the back. Judge Harrison's chair remained conspicuously empty. He had recused himself, citing personal circumstances. Dr. Maya Washington rose from her seat, now standing before the interim judge, but rather than continuing her testimony, she requested permission to address the court. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying the weight of generations, "today's events have highlighted something far more significant than my personal credentials or upcoming role. They've illustrated the persistent challenge of implicit bias in our justice system." She turned to face the packed gallery, her eyes scanning the faces before her, young and old, black and white, those with power and those seeking justice. What occurred this morning wasn't just about one judge or one case. It's about the unconscious assumptions we all carry, the invisible barriers that still exist in courtrooms across our nation. These biases don't always manifest in obvious ways. They hide in interruptions, in dismissive tones, in questioned credentials. The room was silent, every person present aware they were witnessing a moment that would be quoted in legal textbooks for decades to come. But today also gives me hope, she continued, because once we see these biases clearly, we can address them. Justice isn't just about the laws we write, it's about how we apply them, how we treat each person who steps into a courtroom seeking fairness. She paused, allowing her words to settle. As I prepare to take my new role, I want to announce that my first initiative will be implementing comprehensive bias training for all federal judges. Not as punishment, but as recognition that we all have room to grow, to learn, to be better servants of justice. The interim judge, visibly moved, spoke up. Dr. Washington, Chief Justice, I believe I speak for many when I say your handling of this situation has been extraordinary. Thank you, Your Honor, she replied, but the real test of this moment will be what we do next. Will we use it to divide, to punish, to shame, or will we use it to build a stronger, fairer justice system? She turned back to the gallery one final time. My mother used to tell me that true power isn't in making others feel small, it's in helping others rise. Let this be the moment we commit to rising together, to ensuring that every person who seeks justice in our courts finds it, regardless of their background. As she concluded, the silence in the courtroom felt different, not tense or uncomfortable, but filled with possibility. It was the silence of change beginning, of old barriers starting to crumble, of justice taking a step closer to its highest ideals. 6 months later, Judge Richard Harrison stood at a podium in the Supreme Court's Great Hall, addressing a gathering of federal judges. His silver hair had more gray now, and his shoulders carried a new humility. My colleagues, he began, his voice thick with emotion, we speak often of justice being blind. But that day in my courtroom, I was the one who was blind to my own prejudices, blind to the changing face of justice in America. Chief Justice Washington didn't just teach me about bias. She showed me the power of grace under pressure. In the front row, Dr. Maya Washington nodded slightly, the same pearl earrings catching the light as she watched her former adversary become an ally. Harrison's story became required reading in judicial training programs nationwide. The video from that day in courtroom 2 billion was viewed millions of times, not as an example of shame, but as a testament to the possibility of change. Today, when young law students visit the Howard T. Markey Federal Courthouse, they pass a new plaque outside courtroom 2 billion. It reads, "Justice sees not color, creed, or rank, but the heart of truth in every soul who seeks it."